Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Christina Lengel. With me today is our Northeast Regional Editor, Kristen Smith. So this week we had a general election that led to the retention of 3 Supreme Court justices, which would not generally be a big news item, but it was this week. Kristen, you wrote about the impact that the Supreme Court has on taxpayer spending. So can you talk to us a little more about that?
Yeah, this is actually interesting because you first have to the cost to taxpayers is what we were looking at. And so you really have to define cost, right? And depending on where you're looking at it from, this means different things. There is the very direct and obvious cost, which is the money that taxpayers could pay as a result of decisions that a liberal majority court would uphold or overturn, right? In this case, we're talking about things like carbon taxes. We're talking about an issue called gerrymandering that, basically gives plaintiffs more leeway about where to file cases, therefore having a more successful outcome. We can get more into that later. But gerrymandering is thought to often raise healthcare costs. There's other things like Medicaid covering abortion. So these do have financial impacts on the taxpayer, correct? But then you can kind of look at this from the social cost. And from that perspective, people really see a liberal majority as upholding access to abortion and, preventing something like voter ID and the more social impact of where they feel that our laws should be. So we obviously at the center square, we worry a lot about what bothers taxpayers, what's going to cost them. Going back to the issue of gerrymandering, as I mentioned, a lot of the times plaintiffs with medical malpractice cases will seek to have their cases filed in a different jurisdiction, most often Philadelphia. The reason for this is they often believe that at least this is what critics say, that they're going to get a more advantageous settlement in that, or judgment in that case. And when that happens, it trickles down to actual providers who then pass the cost on to consumers and insurance companies, right? So now we're paying higher rates. In the case of carbon taxes, which is something that Democrats really like because it should reduce harmful emissions while also hastening our transition to renewable energy. Republicans in particular worry, and I have done the number crunching that would show that it's going to raise electricity bills by roughly 30%. And so for them, that's obviously another obvious cost, right? So there's many different ways to look at this issue. There's also another interesting way that particularly the gerrymandering issue and malpractice claims has been framed. There's research that describes what we call a tort tax, which again frames the cost around medical care as a result of these malpractice suits. It's roughly $1,400 per resident. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this cost, but surely it's going to cost something no matter what direction you're coming from.
Yes, I think I wrote about, there was a report called Judicial Hellholes once that I wrote about that talked about Philadelphia being a big area for the gerrymandering topic. And I know the catch-22 in there was that the legislature was kind of inactive when it comes to making regulations. And so people kind of have their only recourse when there's a problem with their healthcare is to sue. So it seems like we've really gotten ourselves into a unpleasant tangle there. When you talk about the carbon tax and things like that, these are things, again, that the Supreme Court isn't creating, right? They're ruling on things that the legislature has done.
Right. So much like we see, almost exactly like we see at the U.S. Supreme Court level, the state Supreme Court is the last stop for laws and different things regulations that have been challenged in the Commonwealth Court. And so they work their way up through appeal, and eventually they're on the laps of the judges in the state Supreme Court, which is a 5-2 liberal majority. And they're not there to say, yes, we should have a carbon tax because it reduces greenhouse gases, or we should allow medical or, gerrymandering as it's called. What they're there to say is the law or the regulation as written, is that enforceable and is it constitutional, right? And so those are very narrow questions, but they have very huge impacts on the outcome of a case. I think the most obvious and high profile one, at least at the federal level, would be Roe versus Wade, right? So the conservative majority there overturned Roe versus Wade, which means that it went back to the states for them to determine whether they're going to have constitutional protection for abortion. So that was a very big deal. That is also something that really turned the tide of elections that year. There was midterms. Traditionally, the minority party has what they would call a wave of sorts, but that didn't happen in 2022. In fact, I think they called it the red tide because it kind of just came in and went out. And Democrats really held on to their seats in large part because of the reproductive rights issue. I mean, you even saw states like Kansas, who very historically red, that they voted to have constitutional protection for abortion. So you can see how the cost, again, is something that really affects taxpayers, although it's not as often as high profile as abortion access. But even in Pennsylvania, that strategy and that messaging from Democrats really helped their cause of retaining the justices and keeping that liberal majority on the court. And Republicans really came in with a very similar strategy, just from their perspective of like, you're going to have higher utility bills. Your everyday costs are going to be higher because of some of the rulings that they could make or they have made in the past.
Yeah, I think about the basic education funding, which was a Supreme Court decision that requires a lot more money to go into education. But again, in that case, it was, unconstitutionally bad. So the social cost versus the cost.
Right. Exactly. That's an excellent point to bring up, because there's been, now that we have that constitutional mandate, everybody agrees. And even Republicans and other groups who challenged the merits of the underlying case, even they agreed not to appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court level. Right. So in the state, everyone agrees, yes, we need to fix this. But now it's okay, how do we do this? And it's interesting here because Democrats in this case see it as a very straightforward cost issue. We need to put more money in every single year till we get to a place where the funding is equalized and fair across districts, which is a whole nother can of worms to open up, is exactly what that means. Then you have Republicans who say, hold on now, let's not just throw money at the problem. That's not working. Let's step back and look at, from a policy perspective, the cost of how we've done things, right? And whether we need to reshape the way that we socially address education versus just the amount of money we're putting into it, right? So again, it goes back to that very central cost of what price is the higher to pay? Is it your electricity bills every day? Is it the thought that reproductive rights might be rolled back a little bit? Is it, you don't want voter ID, and a conservative majority court would almost certainly approve voter ID? Are you worried about Medicaid covering abortion services, whether from a ideological standpoint or just from the fact that it does raise costs for people? So that's really where it is what, as a taxpayer, do you find the most tolerable, I suppose, in exchange for what that court decision means.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen. We will keep watching the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and the decisions that, come out of it. It's not always a newsworthy thing, but we'll keep our eye on it. Thank you so much. And for this and everything else, go to thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania.